The stage lights felt like a spotlight on every mistake he'd ever made. Robert walked slowly toward the grand piano, his shoes squeaking against the polished wood floor with each nervous step. The sound echoed through the massive theater, and he could hear a few people in the audience giggle at the awkward noise. His suit didn't fit right. He'd bought it from a thrift store 3 days ago for $12, and it showed. The sleeves were too long, bunching up at his wrists. The pants were too short, showing his mismatched socks. He'd tried his best to look presentable, even borrowed his neighbor's iron to press out the wrinkles. But standing here under these bright lights, he felt like a kid playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Robert was 42 years old, but right now he felt about 12. The Grand Metropolitan Theater was packed. Over 1,000 people filled the red velvet seats, all of them waiting to be entertained by the city's annual talent showcase. Some were here to see genuine talent. Others, if Robert was being honest with himself, were here to laugh at people like him. The ones who didn't quite belong. The ones who looked like they'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up on stage by accident. He could feel their eyes on him, judging, wondering, probably, already deciding he was going to be terrible. 3 celebrity judges sat at a long table in front of the stage. One of them, a woman in an expensive dress, raised her eyebrow as she looked him up and down. Another judge, a man with perfectly styled hair, leaned over and whispered something to the person next to him. They both smiled. Not the encouraging kind of smile. The other kind. Robert's hands were shaking. He'd been so confident when his daughter convinced him to sign up. She'd found an old video of him playing piano years ago and insisted he still had it in him. "Dad, you're amazing," she'd said with those bright, hopeful eyes. People need to see this. Now, standing here, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. He reached the piano bench and tried to sit down smoothly, but his foot caught on the leg and he stumbled slightly. More laughter from the audience. Not mean-spirited exactly, but not kind either. Just people reacting to what they saw. A nervous, awkward man who looked completely out of place. There was a bottle of water sitting on top of the piano, placed there by the stage crew. As Robert adjusted the bench, trying to get the height just right, his elbow knocked into it. The bottle tipped over, rolled across the glossy surface, and fell onto the stage with a loud plastic thud. Water splashed everywhere. The laughter got louder. "I'm so sorry," Robert mumbled into the microphone that was positioned near the piano. His voice came out weak and shaky, barely audible over the sound system. A stagehand rushed out with a towel to clean up the mess, which somehow made everything even more embarrassing. In the audience, people were nudging each other, pointing, grinning. This was turning into exactly the kind of disaster he'd feared. He could see phones coming out now, people getting ready to record what they assumed would be a hilarious failure. In the age of social media, his humiliation would probably be online within minutes. Robert wanted to run. Every cell in his body was screaming at him to stand up, apologize, and get off this stage before things got worse. He could fake a health problem, pretend he'd forgotten the music, make any excuse, and just leave. His daughter would understand. She'd be disappointed, sure, but she'd get over it. But then he thought about her sitting out there in the audience somewhere. She'd used her babysitting money to buy a ticket. She'd helped him pick out the suit from the thrift store, telling him he looked handsome even though they both knew it wasn't true. She believed in him in a way that nobody had believed in him for 20 years. He couldn't let her down. Not again. The judge with the perfect hair spoke into his microphone, his tone dripping with barely concealed amusement. "All right, whenever you're ready. What will you be performing for us today?" Robert cleared his throat. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. There was a moment of surprised silence, then more laughter. Not from everyone, but enough people to make Robert's face burn with embarrassment. It was a bold choice, maybe even an arrogant one coming from someone who looked like him. The ballade was known as one of the most challenging pieces in the classical piano repertoire. Professional pianists trained for years to master it. Who did this janitor think he was? Because that's what Robert was, a janitor. He cleaned office buildings at night, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while other people slept. His hands, now hovering over the pristine white keys, were rough and calloused from years of manual labor. His back ached from pushing industrial cleaning equipment. He smelled faintly of cleaning solution despite the shower he'd taken before coming here. Nothing about him suggested he could play Chopin. The female judge leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Her expression said it all. This was going to be interesting in the worst possible way. The third judge, an older man who'd been silent until now, at least had the decency to look neutral, waiting to hear what would happen. Robert positioned his hands over the keyboard. They were still trembling, but less now. Something was shifting inside him. Yes, he was terrified. Yes, he looked ridiculous. Yes, every rational part of his brain was telling him this was a mistake. But his hands knew these keys. They'd known them once long ago, and somewhere deep in his muscle memory they remembered. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The laughter in the theater hadn't completely stopped. There were still scattered giggles, whispered comments, the rustling of programs as people settled in to watch what they expected to be a train wreck. None of that mattered anymore. In this moment, with his eyes closed and his fingers resting on the cool ivory keys, Robert wasn't in a theater full of strangers. He wasn't a 42-year-old janitor in an ill-fitting suit. He wasn't the guy who just spilled water all over the stage. He was 22 again, sitting in a practice room at music school, playing for the pure joy of it. Before life got complicated, before everything fell apart, before he had to make impossible choices that buried his dreams so deep he'd almost forgotten they existed. His daughter was out there watching. She'd brought him back to this moment. She'd reminded him that he used to be someone else, someone who could create beauty with just his hands and a piano. Robert opened his eyes and began to play. The first notes of the ballade drifted into the theater, soft and gentle, like a memory surfacing after being underwater for too long. His fingers found the keys with surprising certainty, moving through the opening melody with a grace that seemed impossible just seconds after his clumsy entrance. The laughter stopped. Just like that. As if someone had flipped a switch. The entire theater went quiet. People who'd been chuckling and whispering suddenly froze, their attention snapping to the man at the piano. Something was happening. Something none of them had expected. And Robert, for the first time in 20 years, was finally coming home. 20 years earlier, Robert's life looked completely different. Back then, he was a student at one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. Getting accepted had been like winning the lottery. Thousands of talented musicians applied every year, and only a handful made it through the doors. Robert had earned a full scholarship, which was the only reason he could attend at all. His family didn't have money for fancy schools. His professors called him gifted. One of them, a former concert pianist who'd performed in halls across Europe, told him he had something special. Not just technical skill, though Robert had plenty of that. It was the way he connected with the music, the way he could make a piano sing in a way that touched something deep in people's hearts. Robert practiced 8 hours a day, sometimes more. His fingers would ache, his back would hurt from sitting so long, but he didn't care. When he played, nothing else existed. Not his tiny dorm room with its broken heater. Not his part-time job washing dishes at a restaurant near campus. Not the pressure of maintaining his scholarship or the fear of disappointing everyone who believed in him. Just the music. He met Jennifer in his second year. She wasn't a music student. She was studying nursing at a nearby college and had wandered into one of the school's free public concerts one rainy evening. Robert was performing that night, a solo piece he'd been working on for months. After the show, she found him in the lobby and told him his playing had made her cry. They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony with borrowed chairs and homemade decorations. Jennifer wore a simple white dress from a department store, and Robert played the piano at their own wedding reception. They were broke and happy, living in a cramped apartment with dreams bigger than their bank account. Jennifer got pregnant right after Robert graduated. He'd already been accepted into a master's program, had already started making connections with concert halls and competitions. His career was just beginning to take off. A talent agent had reached out about representation. Everything was falling into place. Their daughter Sophie was born on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Robert held her in the hospital, this tiny, perfect human, and felt his heart expand in ways he didn't know were possible. Jennifer was exhausted but glowing, already a natural mother in those first moments. They were tired and overwhelmed, but they were happy. Really happy. 3 months later, Jennifer's car was hit by a drunk driver on her way home from her nursing shift. The hospital called Robert at 2 in the morning. He remembered the phone ringing in the darkness, how his hands fumbled for it, how the voice on the other end was professional but sad. He remembered getting in a cab with baby Sophie still in her pajamas, remembered running through hospital corridors that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Jennifer died 4 hours later without ever waking up. Robert was 24 years old, suddenly a widower with a 3-month-old baby, and no idea how he was going to survive the next 5 minutes, let alone the rest of his life. The funeral was a blur. People said things to him. Kind things, probably, but he couldn't hear them over the screaming in his own head. He held Sophie through the whole service. This little girl who would never remember her mother, who would never know how funny Jennifer was, or how she hummed while cooking, or how she believed in ridiculous things like fate and soulmates. After the funeral came the bills. Medical bills from Jennifer's final hours. Funeral costs. Regular bills that didn't stop just because your world had ended. Robert had some savings, but not much. Students didn't have much money, even with scholarships. He tried to keep going to school. He'd bring Sophie to classes in a carrier, practice while she slept in her car seat next to the piano bench. His professors were understanding at first, making accommodations, offering extensions on assignments. But a baby doesn't care about practice schedules or concert preparations. Sophie would cry during his practice time. She'd need to be fed or changed right when he was supposed to be in class. He was exhausted all the time, running on 3 hours of sleep, trying to be both mother and father to a child who needed everything from him. His playing suffered. The connection he'd once had with the music started to fray. His fingers still knew what to do, but the emotion wasn't there anymore. He was just going through the motions, hitting the right notes but missing the soul of it. 6 months after Jennifer died, Robert's scholarship was in jeopardy. His grades were slipping. He'd missed too many classes. The dean called him in for a meeting, expressed sympathy for his situation, but explained that standards were standards. Other students were competing for his spot. If he couldn't maintain the required level of performance, they'd have to give the scholarship to someone else. Robert looked at his bank account that night. He had $800 left. Rent was due in a week. Diapers and formula cost more than he'd ever imagined. The part-time dishwashing job barely covered groceries. He had a choice to make, though it didn't really feel like a choice at all. He could keep pursuing his music career, keep fighting to stay in school, and risk ending up homeless with a baby. Or he could quit, get a real job with steady pay, and give Sophie the stability she needed. When you put it like that, there was only one answer. Robert withdrew from school 2 weeks later. He sold his piano, the beautiful upright he'd saved for years to buy, for $1,200 to a family whose daughter was just starting lessons. Watching them load it into their truck felt like watching a piece of his soul drive away. He found a job as a night janitor at an office building downtown. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and they needed someone immediately. The hours were terrible, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, but that actually worked better for Robert. He could be with Sophie during the day, take her to the park, feed her meals, play with her. Then a neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, offered to watch Sophie at night for a price Robert could almost afford. And just like that, his life as a musician ended. He told himself it was temporary. Once Sophie was older, once he'd saved some money, once things stabilized, he'd get back to it. He'd practice again, maybe take some classes, work his way back to where he'd been. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when you're not paying attention. Years passed. Sophie grew from a baby to a toddler to a little girl starting kindergarten. Robert moved from the office building to a school, better pay and health insurance. Then to a hospital, even better benefits. The piano became something he used to do, like a hobby he'd outgrown or a sport he'd played in high school. He'd see pianos sometimes, in hotel lobbies or shopping malls, and feel a pang of something. Loss maybe, or regret. But then Sophie would tug on his hand, asking for ice cream or pointing at something in a store window, and the feeling would pass. Robert convinced himself he was fine. He had his daughter. He had a job. He was doing what fathers were supposed to do, sacrificing for their children, putting their needs first. That's what love looked like, right? Giving up your dreams so someone else could have theirs. He almost believed it too, until Sophie turned 16 and found a video. The first notes hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Robert's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that surprised even him. The opening of Chopin's ballade was soft, almost fragile, like something precious that might break if you held it too tight. Each note was placed carefully, deliberately, building a melody that seemed to float through the theater. The audience had gone completely silent. It wasn't the polite silence of people waiting to see what happens next. It was the stunned silence of people who just realized they'd made a terrible mistake. Every person who'd laughed at Robert's entrance, every judge who'd exchanged knowing smirks, every phone that had been pulled out to record a disaster, they all froze in that moment. This man could actually play. In the third row, Sophie gripped the armrests of her seat so hard her knuckles turned white. Tears were already streaming down her face, though the piece had barely begun. She was the only person in the theater who knew what this moment meant. She'd watched the video of her father playing at age 22 so many times she'd memorized every note. But watching it on a phone screen and hearing it live, watching him reclaim something he'd buried for her sake, was completely different. The melody continued its gentle journey, Robert's hands moving with increasing confidence. It had been 20 years since he'd touched a piano with any real intent. Sure, he'd plinked out Happy Birthday on the old keyboard at Sophie's school once or twice. He'd run his fingers across piano keys in furniture stores sometimes when no one was watching. But actually playing, really playing, channeling everything inside him through his hands into music, that hadn't happened in 2 decades, yet his fingers remembered. Muscle memory is a strange thing. You can't completely erase something your body learned so deeply. Robert had practiced 8 hours a day for years. His hands had played this piece hundreds of times, working through every phrase until it became part of him. That kind of training doesn't just disappear, even after 20 years of pushing mops and emptying trash bins. But it wasn't just muscle memory carrying him through. Something else was happening, something deeper. Every note he played carried weight. The soft opening phrases held all those early mornings with baby Sophie, feeding her bottles while the sun came up, too tired to think but pushing through anyway. The gentle rises and falls in the melody spoke of birthday parties he'd worked double shifts to afford, of school plays he'd attended in his janitor uniform because there was no time to change, of scraped knees he'd bandaged and nightmares he'd chased away. The music was telling his story, even though most people in the audience didn't know it yet. One of the judges, the woman in the expensive dress, leaned forward in her chair. Her expression had completely changed. The amused skepticism was gone, replaced by something like shock. She'd judged hundreds of performers over the years, maybe thousands. She knew real talent when she heard it. And this wasn't just talent. This was something else entirely. The piece began to build. Chopin's ballade doesn't stay gentle forever. It has moments of darkness, passages where the music becomes complex and challenging, where a pianist's true skill gets tested. Robert felt the shift coming, the way you feel a storm building on the horizon. His breathing steadied. His shoulders, which had been tense with nervousness just minutes ago, relaxed into the familiar posture of a trained pianist. Without thinking about it, his body remembered how to sit, how to move, how to let the music flow through him instead of fighting it. The tempo increased slightly. His right hand danced across the higher keys while his left hand provided a foundation in the bass notes. The coordination required was immense, both hands doing completely different things but working together to create something unified and beautiful. Still, nobody in the audience moved. People who'd been ready to leave, who'd already decided this would be boring, sat frozen in their seats. The shift had happened so quickly, from comedy to genuine artistry, that they couldn't quite process it. Their brains were struggling to match what they were hearing with what they'd seen. That awkward man in the ill-fitting suit stumbling onto stage, knocking over water bottles. That man and this pianist didn't seem like they could be the same person. But they were. Robert's eyes were closed now. He wasn't reading sheet music. He didn't need to. This piece was written into his soul 20 years ago, and it was still there, waiting. Every phrase, every chord progression, every subtle dynamic change, it all came back to him, as if he'd played it yesterday. As the music grew more complex, his hands began to move faster. Fingers flying across keys, executing runs and arpeggios that required years of training to master. His left hand jumped across octaves while his right hand wove intricate melodies above. The technical difficulty of what he was doing would have been impressive from anyone. From a janitor who hadn't played seriously in 2 decades, it was borderline miraculous. But Robert wasn't thinking about technique. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone or proving anything. He was just playing, letting 20 years of buried emotion pour out through his fingertips. All those nights working alone in empty office buildings, mopping floors while other people slept. All those times he'd walked past music schools and concert halls and felt that ache in his chest. All those moments watching Sophie grow up, proud and terrified in equal measure, wondering if he'd made the right choice, wondering who he might have been if life had gone differently. It was all there in the music. The piece moved into a darker section, the melody becoming more turbulent, more questioning. This was where Chopin showed his genius, taking listeners on an emotional journey that twisted and turned, never letting them get comfortable. Robert poured everything into these passages. His fingers pressed the keys with increasing intensity, the volume rising, the emotion building like pressure in a steam engine. Several people in the audience were crying now, though they couldn't have explained exactly why. Music has that power sometimes. It bypasses all the logical parts of your brain and goes straight to your heart, making you feel things you didn't know you were feeling. The older judge, the one who'd maintained a neutral expression earlier, had tears running down his face. He wasn't even trying to hide it. He'd been a professional musician himself once, had given up a performing career to teach and judge competitions. He recognized what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a good performance. This was a man playing like his life depended on it, because in a way it did. Sophie was sobbing openly now, not even trying to be quiet about it. The woman sitting next to her, a stranger, reached over and squeezed her hand without saying anything. Some moments don't need words. The music swirled and climbed, Robert's hands moving with absolute certainty now. All the nervousness from his entrance had evaporated. This was who he really was. Not the awkward man in the bad suit. Not even the tired janitor working night shifts. This was his truest self, the person he'd been forced to hide away for 20 years, and he was magnificent. The piece was approaching its emotional peak, the moment where everything would come together or fall apart. Robert felt it building, felt the music pulling him toward something big, something that would require every ounce of skill and emotion he had left. His hands positioned themselves for the next passage, the most challenging section of the entire piece, and then he played like a man who had nothing left to lose. The storm hit Robert's. Fingers crashed down on the keys with a force that made several people in the front row jump. The gentle melody that had been building suddenly exploded into something fierce and wild. This was the heart of the ballade, the section where Chopin unleashed everything, where the music stopped being polite and started demanding to be heard. His hands flew across the keyboard faster than seemed humanly possible. Complex runs cascaded from the higher notes down to the bass, like waterfalls of sound pouring through the theater. His left hand pounded out powerful chords while his right hand wove impossibly quick patterns above it. The coordination alone was staggering, but it was the emotion behind every note that made it extraordinary. This wasn't just technical skill. This was 20 years of pain and frustration and sacrifice being released all at once. Every missed opportunity. Every time he'd walked past a piano and felt that hollow ache, every night he'd lain awake wondering what his life might have been, it all came pouring out through his fingers. The music was angry and sad and beautiful and desperate all at the same time, just like life itself. The sound filled every corner of the massive theater. It echoed off the ornate ceiling, vibrated through the wooden floors, seemed to shake the very air. People weren't just hearing the music anymore. They were feeling it in their chests, in their bones, in places they didn't even know could respond to sound. Robert's whole body moved with the music now. His shoulders swayed, his back bent and straightened, his head tilted back as if he were looking at something only he could see. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. His fingers were starting to ache, muscles that hadn't worked this hard in 2 decades protesting the sudden demand, but he couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. The judge with perfect hair had completely forgotten to look composed. His mouth hung slightly open, his pen frozen over his notepad where he was supposed to be writing comments. He'd been judging talent competitions for 15 years and had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a competition performance. This was something raw and real and utterly unfiltered. In the audience, people had forgotten they were supposed to be judging. They'd forgotten about their phones, their programs, their plans for after the show. The only thing that existed in this moment was the music and the man creating it. Several people were openly weeping now, tears streaming down their faces while Robert played on. An elderly man in the back row clutched his wife's hand. He'd been a music teacher for 40 years before retiring, had heard thousands of students play thousands of pieces. He leaned over and whispered to his wife, voice shaking, "I've never heard anyone play like this, never." The music twisted and turned through increasingly complex passages. Robert's fingers executed jumps that covered multiple octaves in an instant, his hands crossing over each other, finding keys without looking, driven by pure muscle memory and something deeper than memory. Every note was exactly where it needed to be, even as the piece pushed him to his absolute limit. And then, just when it seemed like the intensity couldn't possibly increase, Robert pushed even harder. His fingers hammered the keys with almost violent force, the piano resonating with the impact. But it wasn't violent. It was passionate. It was a man pouring his entire soul into something, holding nothing back because this might be his only chance to show the world who he really was, beneath the uniform and the mop bucket and the tired eyes. The technical passages that would make professional pianists nervous flew by without a single mistake. Octave runs in both hands simultaneously. Rapid-fire repeated notes that required perfect finger control. Chord progressions that demanded strength and precision at the same time. Robert executed all of it flawlessly, not because he was trying to show off, but because the music demanded it and his hands still knew how to deliver. Sophie couldn't see through her tears anymore. She'd known her dad was good. The video had shown her that much. But this was different. This was watching someone she'd only known as tired and worn down and quietly sad transform into something powerful and alive. She was seeing who her father had been before she was born, who he might have been if circumstances had been different. And she was seeing it was all because of her. He'd given up this gift for her. Every note he played was proof of how much he loved her, because this was what he'd sacrificed. This magnificence had been buried so she could have food and clothes and a roof over her head. The weight of that realization was almost too much to bear. The music began to shift again. The storm started to calm, the violent passages giving way to something more controlled but no less powerful. This was Chopin's genius at work, knowing when to pull back, when to let the intensity simmer instead of boil. Robert followed every subtle change perfectly, his playing becoming more nuanced, more delicate even while maintaining its emotional force. His fingers, which had been attacking the keys moments before, now caressed them. The notes came softer but no less precise. He played through a series of cascading arpeggios that sounded like rain after a thunderstorm, washing everything clean. The contrast between the fury of moments ago and this gentler section made both more powerful. The female judge in the expensive dress had given up any pretense of professional detachment. She was crying, one hand pressed to her mouth, completely undone by what she was witnessing. She'd judged world-class pianists, had sat through performances by people who'd trained their entire lives for this moment. But something about Robert's playing cut through all the polish and professionalism, straight to the heart of what music was supposed to be. It was supposed to mean something. It was supposed to make you feel something. And right now, everyone in this theater was feeling everything. The piece moved into its final section, the resolution that would bring all the musical themes together. Robert's playing became almost meditative, his fingers finding each note with absolute certainty but also with a tenderness that made your heart ache. These were the most beautiful passages of the entire ballade, where Chopin showed that after all the storm and struggle, there could be peace. Robert played through them like a man saying goodbye to an old friend. Each phrase was given space to breathe, to resonate fully before moving to the next. He wasn't rushing toward the ending. He was savoring every moment, knowing that when this piece ended, something else would end too. This bubble of time where he got to be a pianist again instead of a janitor. This brief window where the rest of the world fell away and only the music mattered. The theater was so quiet, you could hear the mechanism inside the piano as the hammers struck the strings. People were holding their breath, afraid that any sound they made might break the spell. The three judges sat motionless, transfixed, their job of evaluation completely forgotten. Robert's hands moved to the final sequence of notes. The ballade was ending, moving toward its last haunting conclusion. His fingers touched the keys with the gentlest pressure, coaxing out sounds so soft and pure they seemed to come from another world entirely. He played the penultimate phrase, a bittersweet melody that hung in the air like a question. Then his hands moved to play the final note. One last key pressed down. One last sound resonating through the theater. One last moment of perfect crystalline beauty. The note sustained, held by the piano's mechanism, ringing out clear and true. It lasted for several seconds, slowly fading into silence. Robert lifted his hands from the keys and opened his eyes. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The silence was absolute. Then the theater exploded. It started with one person standing up. Then another. Then entire rows were rising to their feet. And suddenly everyone in the massive theater was standing, applauding with a force that seemed to shake the walls. The sound was deafening, a roar of appreciation that rolled over Robert in waves. He sat frozen at the piano bench, completely overwhelmed. His hands were still hovering over the keys, trembling now not from nerves but from exhaustion and emotion. He blinked, trying to process what was happening, but his brain couldn't quite catch up. Just minutes ago, these same people had been laughing at him. The applause didn't stop. It grew louder, more intense. People were shouting, crying, clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. The sound echoed off the ornate ceiling, bounced off the walls, filled every inch of space until it felt like the building itself was celebrating. Sophie was already running down the aisle toward the stage, tears streaming down her face, not caring that she was supposed to stay in her seat. A security guard moved to stop her, but one of the judges waved him off. Let the girl go to her father. Robert finally stood up, his legs unsteady, and turned to face the audience. The ovation somehow grew even louder. He didn't know what to do with his hands. Should he wave, bow? He settled for a small, awkward nod, which only made people cheer more enthusiastically. All three judges were on their feet now. The woman in the expensive dress wasn't even trying to hide her tears anymore. The man with perfect hair looked stunned, like he'd just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about music and talent. The older judge was applauding slowly, deliberately, his face showing a mixture of joy and something like grief, as if Robert's story had reminded him of his own sacrifices and lost dreams. The female judge grabbed her microphone and walked toward the stage, though she had to wait for the applause to die down enough to be heard. It took almost 2 full minutes before the audience finally settled into their seats, though you could still hear sniffling and whispered conversations throughout the theater. "Sir," she said, her voice still thick with emotion, "I need to know. Where did you learn to play like that? Who trained you?" Robert cleared his throat. His voice came out rough and uncertain. "I went to Juilliard. A long time ago." The theater erupted again. Juilliard, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. "Why did you stop playing?" the judge asked, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. Robert looked out at the audience, at the sea of faces all focused on him, waiting. He saw Sophie standing at the edge of the stage now, her eyes encouraging him. "Tell them," her expression said. "It's okay. My wife died," Robert said quietly. The microphone picked it up anyway, carried his words to every corner of the theater. "I had a 3-month-old daughter and no money. I had to make a choice." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the stunned silence of people realizing they'd misjudged someone. This was the heavy silence of people confronting an uncomfortable truth, that talent and dreams don't always win against the harsh realities of survival. "So I quit school," Robert continued, gaining a little more confidence as he spoke. "Sold my piano, got a job as a janitor, and that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years, cleaning buildings at night so my daughter could have what she needed during the day." Sophie was fully crying now, and she wasn't alone. Half the audience was in tears. Even some of the men who'd been filming on their phones earlier had lowered their devices, too moved to worry about capturing the moment. The older judge spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of experience. 20 years. You didn't play for 20 years, and you just performed one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire flawlessly. My daughter found a video of me playing when I was younger, Robert explained. She's the one who convinced me to sign up for this. I told her it was a bad idea, that I was too old, too out of practice, that I'd embarrass myself. He managed a small smile. Guess I was half right about the embarrassment part. At least at the beginning. The audience laughed, but it was warm laughter now, affectionate rather than mocking. The female judge shook her head in disbelief. In 30 years of judging competitions, I have never seen anything like what we just witnessed. Never. This wasn't just technical skill, though you have that in abundance. This was raw, honest emotion channeled through music in a way that most trained pianists never achieve in their entire careers. She turned to address the audience. I don't think any of us will forget what we experienced tonight. This is what music is supposed to be. Not perfect notes on a page, but a human story told through sound. The applause started again, softer this time, but no less genuine. Robert finally climbed down from the stage and Sophie ran into his arms. They held each other while people around them cried and clapped and took photos that would be shared millions of times over the coming days. What happened next? Robert couldn't have predicted in 1,000 years. The video went viral overnight. Someone in the audience had recorded the entire performance on their phone. And by morning it had been viewed over 1 million times. By the end of the week, that number was in the tens of millions. News outlets picked up the story. Talk shows wanted him as a guest. The video of him stumbling onto stage, knocking over the water bottle, and then delivering a performance that left everyone speechless became one of those rare internet moments that transcended the usual cycle of attention and forgetting. But more importantly, real opportunities started coming in. A classical music station in the city offered him a regular spot playing live during their evening program. The pay wasn't huge, but it was something. A wealthy businessman who'd been in the audience that night reached out through the competition organizers. He wanted to fund Sophie's entire college education. No strings attached. I have more money than I need, the man said simply. Your daughter should have the opportunities you didn't get. A prestigious music academy across town offered Robert a position teaching piano to adult students. We have plenty of teachers who can show students the right techniques, the director told him during their meeting. But you can teach them something more important. You can teach them why music matters, why it's worth sacrificing for, why it has the power to change lives. The salary was modest, but it came with benefits and reasonable hours. Robert could finally stop working nights. He could sleep in his own bed, see his daughter more than just the tired hours before dawn. Several recording studios expressed interest in producing an album of him playing classical pieces. They saw the market potential in his story. The janitor who gave up everything and then reclaimed his gift decades later. Robert wasn't sure how he felt about being marketed that way, but Sophie encouraged him. Let them tell your story, Dad. Maybe it'll inspire someone else who thinks it's too late for their dreams. But perhaps the most meaningful thing that happened came a week after the performance. Robert was at work, his last week as a janitor before starting his new teaching position. He was mopping the floor in an empty office building at 3 a.m, just like he'd done thousands of times before. His supervisor found him there, holding a mop in the hallway. The man had seen the video. Everyone had seen the video by now. What are you doing here? His supervisor asked, genuinely confused. I figured you'd quit. Maybe not even show up for your last week. No one would blame you. Robert kept mopping, working the same careful pattern he always did, making sure he got the corners clean. I believe in finishing what I start, he said simply. I took this job 20 years ago to take care of my daughter. Now I'm taking a different job to take care of her in a different way. But this job, these buildings, they gave me what I needed when I needed it most. Least I can do is finish strong. His supervisor stood there for a moment, then nodded with respect and walked away. Robert finished his shift that morning as the sun came up, just like always. He cleaned the bathrooms, emptied the trash cans, locked up the building. Then he went home, kissed his sleeping daughter on the forehead, and for the first time in 20 years,